where some of your critics say, why can you not just respect your students, just use the gender-neutral pronouns? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I'd have to be convinced that doing so would do more good than harm, and I don't believe that. And I think I'm actually in a reasonable position to justify my claim. I think that the danger that's intrinsic to the law far outweighs whatever potential benefit it might produce, especially given that there's no hard evidence whatsoever for any benefit. I would also like to point out that the people who are promoting this legislation claim to be acting on the behalf, say, of the transgendered community, but they weren't not elected nor appointed to act as such representatives and are doing it on their own say-so. I've received many letters, at least 30 now, from transgendered individuals indicating that they are not in accordance with the claims of these so-called representatives to be representing, or with the intent of the legislation, which has actually made them more visible rather than less visible, and the less visible is what they had preferred. With regards to respect, is that you don't meet people, generally speaking, in a mutual display of respect. You generally meet people in a mutual display of alert neutrality, which is the appropriate way to begin an interaction with someone, because respect is something that you earn as a consequence of reciprocal interactions that are dependent on something like reputation, which is also a consequence of repeated interactions. And so the notion that addressing someone by their self-defined self-identity is necessarily an indication of basic human respect for them, I think is an entirely spurious argument, especially given that there's no evidence that moving the language in a compelled manner in this direction is going to have any beneficial effect. We're supposed to assume that just because hypothetically the intent is positive, that the outcome will be positive. And any social scientist worth his or her salt knows perfectly well that that's rarely the case. So,
Dr. Brown, you've talked about non-monetary orders that could include sanctions, like orders to undertake sensitivity and anti-bias training.
Well, I have a profound objection to undergoing such training. In fact, I would flatly refuse under all conditions to undergo it. And the reason, there's multiple reasons for that. The first reason is that the science surrounding the so-called charge of implicit bias that's associated with perception is by no means settled to such a degree that one of the three people who designed the most commonly used measure, which is the implicit association test, has detached himself from the other two researchers on the grounds that the use of the test has far transcended its scientific validity and reliability. It's nowhere near valid or reliable enough to be used in the manner that it's been using. And even the more pro-IAT researchers who developed the test have admitted to that publicly, even though they haven't stressed it nearly to the degree they should have. So first of all, the science is not settled and is being used absolutely inappropriately. And I can say that as a clinician because I know and as a psychometrician, I know the criteria for using a test for essentially diagnostic purposes, and the IAT doesn't even come close to what's necessary. And then the next issue is, well, where's the evidence that anti-unconscious bias training works? There's no evidence, and what little evidence there is suggests that it actually has the opposite effect, because people don't like being brought in front of a re-education committee and having their fundamental perceptions, you see, their perceptions, not even their thoughts, but their perceptions themselves, altered by collective fiat.
And I'm quoting from the Ontario Human Rights Commission document. They're saying, we're not mandating pronouns. You can always use the person's chosen name as a respectful approach.
I would say then that's actually an indication of just exactly how poorly the policy documents are written, because I can quote this one, which is also from the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, that says, and I quote, refusing to refer to a person by their self-identified name and proper personal pronoun constitutes gender-based harassment. And so if the policies were written in a coherent manner and there wasn't internal contradictions, then your statement would be a reasonable objection. But since it's not written that way, and I do believe firmly that that's a testament to the degree to which it's a poorly written set of policies, is that it's full of internal contradictions, and that'll be worked out very painfully within the confines of people's private lives.
The Ontario Human Rights Commission policy does not say that refusing to use a person's self-identified name or personal pronoun does constitute gender-based harassment. I may be wrong, but I believe it said it could. And I think that's a real difference. If I turn to you and say, look, please call me they, because that's how I see myself now, because it's hurtful for you to call me sir or miss, whatever it would be, but you refuse. And I say, well, okay, if you're uncomfortable with that because you're not comfortable with that, call me Mark. And you refuse. Were you to continue to call me by the name that I'm telling you is hurtful to me, is that not, in fact, something that that the law can properly address? This is, you are knowingly hurting me. And in that respect, our courts ultimately, I think, are capable of striking a proper balance between people who slip up or who, for whatever reasons, just can't get the words out of their mouth, and those that persist in intentionally causing harm.
To respond.
Would you agree with my characterization of free speech as it applies to these issues?
Well, so I would say that the very idea that calling someone a term that they didn't choose causes them such irreparable harm that legal remedies should be sought, rather than regarding it as a form of impoliteness, that legal remedies should be sought, including potential violation of the hate speech codes, is an indication of just how deeply the culture of victimization has sunk into our society.
So I'm trying to square what you, as a party of one, are saying with published documents from the Canadian Psychological Association, the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the United Nations human rights experts. So these are all, these are not parties of one. They are associated. They are all, I imagine, lots of psychologists are members of the Canadian Psychology Association and the Canadian Psychiatry. So how are we to square what you're saying, which is your opinion, which you are absolutely entitled to, with what everyone is saying, plus the feelings and testimonies of the people who have suffered over 30 years, who've been taking issues to court? These are people who we've listened to. So how are we to square this?
Okay, well, with regards to your second point, if the people that you're listening to aren't randomly selected from a population, then their opinions are worthless from the perspective of testimony, because you don't know if you're dealing with a biased sample. And that's a big problem with the public consultation process that underlied this bill. And you can not appreciate that if you'd like, but it's standard practice in any polling institution or any body that's attempting to extract a genuine opinion out of a so-called community of people. And if that isn't followed, then you can't tell if the information that you're receiving is biased. And this, with regards to your first point, what exactly are all those people who aren't thinking the same way as me saying? You said that there's a bunch of them and a bunch of groups, but you never said what they're saying precisely.
Well, I think our chair would rule me out of order if I proceeded.
No, you're fine.
To read out what they're all saying. But in general, they say they oppose discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression. And then there's 3 pages, which I can share with you.
I oppose discrimination against gender identity and gender expression. That's not the point. The point is the specifics of the legislation that surrounds it and the insistence that people will have to use compelled speech. That's what I'm objecting to. I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life, people who don't fit in all sorts of different ways. I'm not a discriminatory person. There's 500 hours of my teaching to my classrooms on tape on YouTube, and nobody's found a smoking pistol. I'm not a discriminatory individual, but I think this legislation is reprehensible, and I do not believe for a moment that it will do what it intends to do. I also don't think that my opinion deviates substantially from the bodies that you're describing, because you haven't provided any evidence that they say anything other than discrimination is a bad thing. And I think that unreasonable discrimination is a bad thing. And it's unreasonable when people are judged for any reason other than the specific competence that they bring to, say, a given position. It's not in anyone's best interest that that occurs. But I don't think that you've demonstrated in the least that the opinions that I'm putting forward exist in opposition to the standard practices, say, of my particular discipline. So
May I follow? Could you repeat one more time your response to Senators Gold and Pratt that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has provided what I would say reasonable alternatives to your objection to using pronouns?
Well, I think it's been made clear in the presentation so far is that it depends on which part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies you read. And that's a big problem. I mean, one of the reasons I criticized this to begin with was because when I went through the policies, I could see that they're absolutely incoherent. So, for example, here, let me give you another example. So there's an insistence in the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual preference is an immutable phenomena, which indicates, at least in principle, that it's biologically grounded. But by the same token, in exactly the same policies, they presume that sexual identity, and gender expression are entirely independent. It's like, sorry, guys, you can't have both of those because one's A and one's not A, and you can't put those together. And like, there's endless numbers of places in the policy surrounding Bill C-16 that are characterized by that kind of logical incoherency. And I mean, what's it going to do to people who are transgender, who are making the claim that they were, say, born that way at birth, which is a strong claim? That's a biological claim. It indicates that there's a direct causal connection between some biological phenomena and the expression of a particular identity. It's actually the strongest defense that people who have, let's call them non-standard sexual identities or gender identities, have to defend their claims.
Are there studies or statistics about the consequences that this bill would have on those people? Would this bill save as many lives and help as many people as it says?
Well, in principle, we would have that information if the policies that have already been introduced by the provincial governments were assessed properly. But as far as I know, there's been no studies indicating that the introduction of this legislation specifically has done anything to modify the unfortunate rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, and so forth that are characteristic, well, you could say often of marginalized groups, but that's a bit of an overstatement. So no, I don't. That was part of my original claim, is that there's no evidence that this sort of legal redress, let's say, is going to produce any of the positive consequences that are intended. And I do believe that by making the issue, let's say, painfully visible, that's one way of thinking about it, it's actually had the opposite effect. And it's very, very common, and this is something that's well known in the relevant social sciences, that just because you intend something to happen when you make a large-scale transformation doesn't indicate in any manner that that's going to be the outcome. I mean, it would be lovely if things were that simple. And I mean, the best social scientists always insist that you build an outcome analysis into any broad-scale, what would you call, social intervention, because there's a good chance it'll backfire. There's a high chance it'll backfire. So it's all presupposition. And it's based, at least in part, on the notion that the transgender community is a community and that there are voices that speak for them homogeneously and that this is what they all want and that it will work as intended. And to me, looking at this from the social science perspective, there's nothing about it that's credible.
Missy?
And I also don't buy the intent.
What this shows is that with Bill C-16, we are prematurely shutting down a discussion on gender and sex that is far from settled, or appears to be far from settled. And in my opinion, when we look to the provincial definitions set up by the commissions, we are enshrining the theory of a gender spectrum into the law. I wonder if you can comment on that.
That's exactly what we're doing. And I think that might even be more dangerous than, in my opinion, than the compelled speech issue, because the social constructionist view of gender isn't another opinion; it's just wrong. So, and I can tell you why that is fairly. I'll take 1 minute to do that.
Please.
Well, the proposition that's instantiated, for example, in this particular visual, which is a good representation of the philosophy of the policies, is that there's no causal relationship between these four dimensions of identity, and that's palpably absurd. I mean, 98% of people, it's 99.7% of people who inhabit a body with a given biological sex identify with that biological sex. They're incredibly tightly linked. If you can't attribute causality to a link that's tight, you have to dispense with the notion of causality altogether. And then of the people who identify, say, as male or female, who are also biologically male or female, the vast majority of them have the sexual preference that would go along with that, and the gender identity, and the gender expression. These levels of analysis are unbelievably tightly linked, and the evidence that biological factors play a role in determining gender identity is, in a word, overwhelming. There isn't a serious scientist alive who would dispute that. Now, you get disputes about it, but they always stem from, essentially, from the humanities. And as far as I'm concerned, I've looked at it very carefully. Those arguments are entirely ideologically driven. It's a tenet of the ideology that identity is socially constructed. And that's partly why it's been instantiated into law, because there's no way they're going to win the argument. But they can certainly win, let's say, the propaganda war, especially by foisting this sort of reprehensible advertising information on children. And that's part of the express intent.
When the court eventually faces a question touching on transgender identity, these two propositions will provide essential frames of reference. First one, that identity is not fixed, but changing. That's the first proposal. And then the second one, that identity is not innate, but contextual.
Okay, so let's assume that it is changing and contextual.
Yeah.
Okay, then why is conversion therapy a problem? See, the thing is that when I started opposing this bill, people immediately assumed that I was transphobic and racist and all these other epithets that they're perfectly willing to trot forth at a moment's notice. But you know, there's been a tremendous attempt to make conversion therapy for people who are gay illegal, right? And the proposition is predicated on the idea that the identity, the sexual preference identity, is not changing nor contextual. It's fundamental, and really what that means is that it's grounded in something like biology. It's okay, fine, let's scrap that, okay? Now it's going to be changing and contextual. Okay, then why can't it be changed with context? And so this is part of the problem with the policies, is they're so incoherent that they're going to work against the people that they're designed to protect. Now, people have a hard time believing I care about that, but you know, the fact that I've been called things doesn't mean that that's what I am. So, you know, a lot of people who have, let's call it a non-standard identity, the tightest argument they have for public acceptance of that identity is that it's powerfully constrained by biological processes that are beyond their voluntary control. So instantiate this view of humanity, the social constructionist view of humanity, and you can wave those claims goodbye, because they're completely, they are at complete odds with the social constructionist viewpoint. And I think that's a big mistake. And I really do believe that that will backfire hard against the people who this legislation is designed to protect. If it's mutable, changeable, only subjective and transformable on a whim, then why should anyone have any respect for it?